Last time I was with you, which I think was about 3 weeks ago, we studied the family life of Jesus. We were not able to complete it, and so I would like to do so today and then get on to our regular lesson. As we studied 3 weeks ago, we found that the life of Jesus was really, except for the miraculous birth, the life of Jesus as a young man was a relatively quiet and insignificant. We know that Joseph, his father, was a very worthy, well-respected Hebrew man, a carpenter, a young man, and he was chosen by God to be Jesus' foster father. So he certainly had to have some standing. The mother, Mary, was a very young lady. The Jewish law allowed females of the age of 12 to marry and males as young as 13 to marry. We do not know how old Joseph was when he married, but we do know that Mary was a very, very young person. We know that Joseph and Mary, as required by Hebrew law, entered into a prenuptial agreement. That is, a year before they marry, they have to enter into an agreement that they will abide by all of the Jewish laws pertaining to marriage, certainly abstinence from any sexual activity with other people. When it came out that Mary was, in fact, expecting a child, needless to say, this caused great consternation in her family and in Joseph's family. Joseph was a good man, but he was concerned that he was getting into an awkward situation with Mary having this child. He made up his mind that he would leave Mary, not to try to hurt her, but just quietly walk away from her life and never see her again. We know, though, that the angel appeared to Joseph and asked him to stay and explain the entire situation to him. And he did, in fact, stay, and he and Mary did, in fact, get married. We know before Jesus is born, Mary is expected the Christ child. We know that Augustus Caesar required all families to come to their home county or home province to be taxed. We know that Mary and Joseph made the arduous trip to Jerusalem so that they could adhere to the requirement of the taxation. Here, the Christ child was born. When Herod, the brutal Herod, the local government official, found out about this birth, this child, he placed a bounty on this child's head and requested that he be found and murdered. He did not want a threat that this young man was going to be the king of the Jews. Joseph and Mary and the young infant, hearing this, left for Egypt by donkey, a long, arduous trip for a young couple like this. We know very little else about Jesus and his family other than the fact that Joseph took him into his carpentry business, taught him the skills of carpentry, and also instilled in him great Jewish Hebrew religious principles. We know that the family went to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover when Jesus was 12. And this is where Jesus disappeared in the crowd, and his mother and father later found him, and he was talking to the priest and the educated people, and on a one-on-one basis explaining Hebrew law to them. This is where we know that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. We know nothing else about Joseph from this point. Jesus is 12 at this point, and 18 years later lapse until Jesus begins his ministry. Supposedly during this 18 years, Joseph died, because we do know that the oldest son of a family would take over instead of the father and provide for the mother and the siblings. We know from the book of Mark that Jesus had 3 brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Jude, and 2 sisters. We know nothing about the sisters, and they're apparently never mentioned again in the Bible. Jesus begins his earthly ministry, and his first ministry, they're a close-knit family, and the entire family goes with Jesus and his mother, and they go to this mission in an adjoining town. Jesus receives widespread recognition for his learnedness and for the miracles that he performs, and his name spreads throughout the region as to this young man that's now the promised Messiah. When they return home, his local people are angry at him to the extent that they attempt to throw him off of a cliff. amazingly enough, Jesus' own brothers, do not intervene and try to help Jesus in this situation. Again, Jesus goes on a second missionary trip, and this one is even more successful, and his fame is continuing to grow. But when he comes home from this trip, he is treated harshly. His local people, including his brothers, will have nothing to do with him. And this is where it's stated that a prophet is without honor in his own hometown. The next thing that we know is that Jesus is now alien from his brothers. They apparently completely turn against him in his ministry. We know the next step, and it has to be a terrible one where we left off last time, is that Jesus is hanging on the cross, and he looks out, and to his horror, there's his dear sweet mother with several other ladies, none of his brothers, but his beloved disciple, John. This would be a terrible disappointment to the mother to know that her other children were not supporting her son, and in this horrible hour. But Jesus says to his mother, "This is my son, this is your son here," speaking of John, "and you're to go with him." He likewise tells John that you are to take care of my mother the rest of her life. So this is where we left off last time, and the next events, and this is at a terrible point in the story of Jesus, but it does get better, because after the resurrection, Jesus meets in the upper room with the 12 disciples, and they see that he is the risen Lord. He later meets with 500 of the close brethren to him in his religion. And then he meets with his brother James. We do not know what happens in this meeting, but we do know as a result of the meeting with James that the other three brothers also join Jesus and James, and there's a reconciliation. The brothers ask Jesus for his forgiveness for the way they've treated him, and they become part of his team. And supposedly, we know very little about Simon and Joseph, but supposedly James and Jude played a huge part in the organized religion started by Jesus' ministry, and we know that they did, in fact, help spread Christianity throughout the world that was known at that time. And so now we must get to today's Sunday school lesson, the assigned lesson that I have, and that is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's Daniel 30, verses 1 through 3. I'm not going to read it to you, but if you have the opportunity, you might read that chapter 3. The purpose of the lesson today is to help God's people endure in faith despite the consequences. Now, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is that their nation has been conquered by the Babylonians. King Nebuchadnezzar is the ruler of Babylon, and he is required in the captivity of the Hebrew community that certain capable young men be taken captive so that they can help with the transition from in captivity in Babylon. We know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are three such individuals. They, in fact, received the attention of Daniel, and Daniel himself recommends to King Nebuchadnezzar that these three men be given special treatment in the government because of their ability. And they are, in fact, placed in charge of some of the governmental affairs of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar becomes so powerful and worldly that he decides that he needs to have an idol built in his honor. And so he erects a 90-foot idol, a statue, there in the kingdom, and sends notice to all of the people, all the officials in the country, to come at a certain point and to worship with this idol. This includes, Nebuchadnezzar includes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All of the governing authorities, or people that have any authority, go to this ceremony. They are told when the band begins to play that they must kneel down in homage to this idol. The band plays, and all the people do, in fact, kneel down, except three men. And a Babylonian guard goes to Nebuchadnezzar and says, there are three young Hebrew men that are not following your dictates. Nebuchadnezzar is infuriated, and he calls the three men before him. He says, I'm going to give you one more chance. You're required, when the band plays, to kneel in homage to this idol. They refused to do so, and they tell Nebuchadnezzar, said, we are not going to disobey our God. Our God, we pay strict adherence to. We know that he will take care of us despite what matter we may face. But even if he doesn't take us out of the dangers of this fire, we're still not going to go against him. And so Nebuchadnezzar is infuriated, and he commands that these three young men be bound and placed in a huge furnace. The furnace, to make sure that these men suffer, Nebuchadnezzar insists that the fire be placed 7-fold times the normal heat. He bounds them, has them bound, and they are thrown into the fire. Nebuchadnezzar walks up to the furnace and looks in there and sees, to his astonishment, that the three young men are walking around with their clothes on and not being affected by the fire. And to his amazement, there is a fourth person in there walking around. Nebuchadnezzar is astonished, and he tells the guards to stop the fire, goes over to the gate and opens the gate or the door to the furnace, and these three young men come out. The fourth person was an angel from God, and that person, of course, does not come out at this point. Nebuchadnezzar realizes that something phenomenal has occurred here, and rather than punish these three young men anymore, he completely changes his attitude towards them, and he says to them, if your God is this great and will take care of you in this fashion, then I'm going to change my way of living, and I'm going to follow your God likewise. And so that's a happy story. That story, it seems to me, tells us several things. At one, it speaks clearly of the devout faith of these three young men. It speaks of the fact that regardless of what their consequences might be, they did not know if God would rescue them from the fire, but it did not matter because they were going to place their complete faith and trust in God. And the third thing I think it does, and this could apply to us here today in Corinth, these three young men were very religious people. They lived good lives, and even in this trial of the fire, they never wavered in their belief in God. I think it could possibly tell us something. Certainly we don't have probably the great religious principles that these three young men had, but in our day-to-day lives, we could very likely have an influence on other people, some good, some bad. And so I think the thing that we can learn today is if we would listen or read the lesson of these three young men and how their God saved them, and what an impact this had on Nebuchadnezzar to the extent that he completely changed his lives. Perhaps in some small way, we too might be an influence on others. At this time, I'm going to take the prayer in our end of our Sunday school lesson. I've changed it just a little bit. Lord, we worship you as the God who meets with us, comfort and peace in life's most trying times. Help us to utilize the love you have for us so that our lives may effectively influence others around us. Amen.